Hello, U.S. history students. This video is on topic 1.6, which focuses on cultural interactions between Europeans, specifically the Spanish, and Native American societies. Um, Now, there's a variety of ways that these groups interacted. And while the vast majority of Europeans believed that they were culturally superior to Native Americans, they held this racist, ethnocentrist point of view that their Western society and culture was better than what had existed in the Americas, there were still debates amongst Europeans and amongst, in particular, the Spanish, but across Europe too, over how Native Americans should be treated and like what was the best manner to promote assimilation of Western culture over the Native Americans. So we're kind of treading a fine line here. Europeans felt they were superior. They had this racist ideology, and they felt that they should assimilate Native Americans, specifically to Christianize them. But there was disagreement about what's the best way, and there were a lot of people that felt, not a lot, but a growing minority that felt that the method of the encomienda system, the coerced labor, and the forced conversions were actually causing more harm and were inhumane. Um, Whereas I'd say the slight majority of Europeans felt like it was fine to do that. So this debate over the best manner Europeans should use for assimilating Native Americans and spreading Christianity came to a head in this thing called the Valladolid debate. Valladolid is a city in Spain, and it was about a year-long formal debate between two religious leaders that represented at opposite ends of the spectrum. The first name to know is Juan de Sepulveda. Sepulveda was one of the most well-known religious figures at the time in Spain. He had close ties to the Pope. He was extremely educated. If you're talking about like contemporary history, he'd be somebody that like if you were watching the news, you would recognize his character. He was a well-known European and a theological giant. And he wrote a book and then had like a bunch of speeches that were called "The Just Causes for War Against the Indians." And in his message was that it was justified, that it was okay that the Spanish used a harsh method of colonization and assimilation. So the encomienda, enslavement, beating people if they don't convert right away or if they're not working, that was justified. That's what Spain should do. And he's going to argue in these writings that Native Americans were less than human. Again, like extremely racist ideology here, which is par for the time and an extremely but Eurocentric point of view that Europe was better than everything else. And he also believed that Native Americans benefited by the encomienda system and from being enslaved, that they were better off to be treated like this than to be free to the way that they had been living. It's worth pointing out that Sepulveda had no contact with Native Americans and did not travel to the Americas, and so he really never saw any of this firsthand. On the other end of the spectrum was Bartolome de la Casa. De la Casa believed that Native Americans were being horrifically mistreated, and he criticized significantly the treatment of these indigenous people, most famously in his collection of journal entries called A Short Account of the Destruction of the Indies. De la Casa was a missionary who had traveled to the Americas rather early in the process of colonizing the Americas, the Spanish Empire growing over there, and he had went over there with all intention of spreading Catholicism and converting these people. And he saw the mistreatment, he saw the beatings, he saw the death from disease, he saw the horrors, and he lived it. And he made this huge crusade to try and end the encomienda system and get better treatment for Native Americans. He's going to argue that natives are completely human, and although they're different, and he feels like European culture is still superior to Native American culture and society, he felt like as far as being humans and having the same moral abilities as anybody else, that they were equal to Europeans, and that this use of essentially slavery in the encomienda system was unjustifiable. So you got one person defending it, one person saying that it's atrocious, and they're debating back and forth. And ultimately, there was no clear-cut winner. There wasn't any massive changes that happened after this, one way or the other. Prior to this meeting, the encomienda system had already begun to be outlawed a little bit, and there had been some changes and revisions made to it. But it sort of shows this big split. So there's a good chance on your test you're going to get, a passage from Sepulveda or from De la Casa, and this shows this debate about the process Europeans used in colonization, one saying that was not too harsh, and one saying that it was way too harsh and dehumanizing. As Spain continued to grow its empire, a lot of its rivals became jealous of their growing influence and power, and they used their treatment of Native Americans as propaganda against Spain. And this becomes known as the Black Legend. And this picture here from Theodore de Bry from 1618, so, while into Spanish colonization, depicts the Spanish slaughtering the Native Americans wholesale and brutalizing them. He did engravings of images of Spanish feeding baby Native Americans to wolves and to dogs and to all kinds of horrific things. And while it's totally true that the Spanish were extremely harsh to Native Americans and that the Encomienda system was slavery, the argument that the Spanish Empire was only murdering people, only raping people, only doing these things is not 100% true. And you have these mixed race groups that are formed. You have mixed race families being created. Um, you know, and some of them are created through violence, but some are not. And like the Black Legend was used by groups like the Dutch and the English to make the Spanish look like they're morally deficient and that they're the worst of the European colonizers. Um, so in reality, the Spanish were horrific to Native Americans and to Africans who were brought over via the Atlantic slave trade. But the Black Legend takes it to like another level. And it also hides the fact that really most European countries that come over and colonize will not treat Native Americans great. The Dutch will trade with them and interact with them, and they'll be less violent towards them, but they're going to want no social mingling or racial mixing between them and Native American groups, which is different than the Spanish who embraced that, which was why they led to their racial caste system. The English will want absolutely nothing to do with the Native Americans, and eventually will fight many wars to seize their land and take where they live in their colonies. And so all European groups, or most European groups, were pretty horrific to the Native Americans. The Black Legend was propaganda used to make the Spanish look worse. It's a great thing for interpretation because you can say that this was a justifiable portrait of Spanish colonization. You can also point out the nuance that it's speaking in extremes and not taking into accountability the actions of other European countries that were making this propaganda. And then the last example of interactions to be aware of is that there was cultural misunderstandings between Europeans and Native Americans. And this goes beyond just the Spanish. It involves the Spanish, French, Dutch, and English. And there's also ways that the Native Americans tried to resist colonization. I'd say the most well-known example of Native American resistance would be the Pueblo Revolt or Pope's Rebellion. There's a statue of Pope. He was a spiritual leader of the Pueblo Indians. And the Pueblo Indians existed in what is now New Mexico and Arizona. Those tribes were there. They had been colonized by the Spanish. The Encomiendas had gone north, as well as missionaries. And after several decades of harsh treatment and Christianization by the Spanish over these Pueblo Indians in southwestern North America, there was a gigantic revolt. And led by Pope, the Pueblo Native Americans knocked out or chased out and kicked out the Spanish from that area of their empire. And they were able to maintain their independence for over a decade. So these Native Americans are going to govern themselves after expelling the Spanish. Eventually, the Spanish come back with greater force, greater power, and they seize back the lands that they had lost. They defeat the rebellion. They put them back under colonial control. But in response to all this violence and carnage, they are less harsh to the Native Americans. They are less forceful with their coerced labor practices and less demanding for complete, Christianization and spreading of Christianity. So you have example of like conflict and some resistance. It was not successful in the end, but it did lead to some positive changes for the Native Americans. Some Native American tribes will resist European expansion by allying themselves with other European countries that are expanding. So when the English and the French are both starting to colonize North America, the French treated the Native Americans far better than the English did. And so many Native American tribes will ally with the French, thinking that, the enemy, my enemy is my friend, or that the French were the lesser of two evils. They'd rather have the French there than the English because the French were trade partners that were less hostile, and the English wanted war and wanted them to leave. So they'll ally with one group and work against the other. And then also Native Americans left. They saw violence coming. They saw a war that they probably could not win. They saw the destruction of disease. And so many of them just fled their homes and went to new locations and migrated further west or away from European colonizers. So there was a temporary fix because Europeans will continue to expand into the Americas. And then some cultural misunderstandings to be aware of between Europeans and Native Americans. One is politics. Native American tribes saw themselves as distinct groups and not part of a larger body. Each tribal group had their own leader and they were really only loyal to that particular tribal group. Whereas Europeans, they would see all the Native Americans as like one large group, which was not the case. There are dozens of different tribes and people that often fought each other or coexisted, but they were not one cohesive unit. And because they were a bunch of small independent tribes, they will ultimately be easier to be defeated by the more uh, codified European colonizers. Another misunderstanding was gender. Many Native American societies were matrilineal, meaning they passed the family name, the heritage through the female or the matriarch of the family, the mother of the family. So in Europe, that's the opposite. You would do that through the patriarch or the father. So like last names are passed down through the father's line, not the mother's line. There was a ton of confusion over land. Natives did not own individual land. You didn't think you could own land. You have something that you could use, you had to be thankful for, and the religion was animistic and based around protecting the land and being respectful for it. Whereas Europeans are like, if I put a fence around this, I own this land. And really, owning land was a sign of one's wealth and success. So this concept of like being able to actually own land, it did not exist for Native American tribes, regardless of the tribe. And for Europeans, it was the sole measurement of like power and influence was, well, this is our land. And then they had different religions. Native Americans practiced versions of animism that'd be polytheistic, applying spirits to natural elements in the world around them. And for Europeans, they're going to be monotheistic Christians at this point, and they're going to see animism and not really understand it because it's a really abstract idea for them. And they're going to see people that don't particularly have a religion often, and they're not going to understand the nuances of animism. And so some Europeans will think they're great people to be converted to Christianity because they don't have a religion, and others are not going to care because they think their religion's superior. But there was misunderstandings about how they worshipped. There were some ways that Native Americans benefited by interacting with the Europeans, and that was typically through trade. Native Americans did adapt a lot of technology from Europeans that had been manufactured, so weapons, guns, new types of clothing, food, resources, that stuff from Europe and the old world that had not been brought over yet. Many of it was beneficial for Native Americans, and to trade for that good would often give you an advantage over your rival tribes in an area. So that was a positive interaction, although it did lead to more conflict, and you could then argue that it was also a negative one in the long run. All right, so there's some examples of European and Native American cultural interactions. We have the Valladolid debate and the debate in Spain and Europe about how Native Americans should be treated, although it should be worth noting that Europeans felt that they were culturally superior to Native American societies, regardless of where they fell in that debate. We also have different ways that Native Americans resisted expansion, and we have a variety of misunderstandings between the different cultural practices of Europeans and Native Americans. Hope this video was helpful. Have a great day.